You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmong Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle or me at leadersandlegends.net. And as always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. MacAllister. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is Dave Hyde. Dave is a sports columnist for the South Florida Sun-Sentinel newspaper of Fort Lauderdale. He has won numerous journalism and sports writing awards. He is a graduate of Miami of Ohio. And he is on today to talk about his book with Jimmy Johnson. It's called Swagger. And I can't imagine a more appropriate name for a book about Jimmy Johnson. I'd like to know how long you all debated what to call it.
Well, that it is, as soon as that name was thrown out, and I didn't think of it. I actually had a different title longer that played off the Pygmalion theory of Jimmy's and everything.
Sure.
And the publisher, Brian Bafiglio, the editor at the publishing house, threw it out there. And as soon as we heard it, we go, yeah, that's the title. It's perfect. It sums up in one word everything about Jimmy. And so, and you know, they say don't judge a book by its cover, but you can judge this one.
Well, yeah, because it's got Jimmy Johnson's blue eyes, 3 championship rings, and it says it's called Swagger: Super Bowls, Brass Balls, and Footballs, a memoir by Jimmy Johnson and Dave Hyde. Was the book a long time coming? Was it something that you had to convince him to do, or was he willing to do it and just needed a co-author?
Yeah, it took about 3 seconds of conversation with Jimmy. I was actually down in Island Mirada visiting the Hall of Fame. He went into the Hall of Fame and was interviewing him for a column. And we've known each other, obviously, when he was coaching here, but then through the years of retirement, probably got to know each other better and more relaxed conversations. And I was looking to do a book and threw it out there to him. I thought, you know, I was fascinated. He's had people. He still has people, NFL coaches, general manager, EA people, call him up and come down to the Keys and visit him and pick his brain on, you know, evaluating talent, building organizations. You know, what are the most important things to look for when you're evaluating talent? And so I was always fascinated that here he is, you know, more than 2 decades out of football, and still people are coming to him. And so I proposed it at his house. Hey, you ever think of doing a book? Because I'm fascinated, not just about your career and summing up some of the loose ends there, what happened at the Cowboys, and, you know, going into Fox and all that stuff, but how you went about your business of building an organization and a winner, and what these people are still coming down all these years later to talk to you about. And he looked in the, threw it out there, and he said, "Okay, let's do it." And I was like, "Whoa, wait, why don't you think about it for a little bit?" Okay. But I didn't know, he said his good friend, a longtime lawyer, Nick Christian, had been telling him he needs to do a book, the same idea. And Jimmy liked the idea of making it contemporary with people coming down and seeing him now. And really his thoughts apply now. All his, way he organization and evaluates talent and sees people, it all applies. So it was a fun, it really wasn't a hard sell at all, fortunately, because I didn't have a big spiel laid out.
You anticipated one of my questions, and that is, I don't know of any other, and I'm guessing you do because you hear the chatter, any other former coach of the NFL whose place is such a pilgrimage for current coaches, pro and college. Maybe Parcells. I don't know. Does Walsh or Gibbs or some of the other Super Bowl winning coaches, Brian Billick? I just never hear the stories of, and maybe it's because I read your columns and read the South Florida papers because I'm a Miami Dolphins fan, that happens with any other coaches. What, am I wrong, or what makes Jimmy so special?
Yeah, I think Parcells has a big tree of people, and a lot of coaches. There's an inner circle of coaches. They go and pick each other's brain, but not like Jimmy. I think where people out of the blue call him, the San Antonio Spurs general manager calls, the guys from college football he's never met, Burt Balema calls,
Mm-hmm.
and they all come. I think they're coming to the Keys, but the separate part is he'll meet with them and lay out who he was and how he went about his business, and everybody's looking for an idea, whether it's how to get a better draft in the NFL or how to manage players better. And Jimmy was a master at that. Everybody talks him going into the Pro Football Hall of Fame as a coach, but he really went into me. He changed the way front offices think in the how to draft people, how to make trades. Before he made the draft value chart where he plotted on a chart point values for every draft pick through 12 rounds at the time, and that way someone calls and say, I'll give you a third and a fifth round pick for your second round pick. Well, he would go to the chart and look up the point totals and in favor of him, he'd make the trade. He also investigated what teams made good trades, what team made bad trades, to look for trade partners. So he worked a lot of different ways and thought a different way. So as much as people talk about him going in the Pro Football Hall of Fame as a coach, what he did on the general manager side in the front office was probably more lasting as far as the way it changed the game than what he did on the sideline.
Okay, so you can surreptitiously or somehow see all of my questions because you just answered another question that I had written down about how did Jimmy change the NFL. Let me talk about the draft chart for a little bit. There's been some pushback on it. Famously, it was the Indianapolis Colts general manager or president, Bill Polian, who took issue with the chart. And his argument was not all drafts are the same. There are drafts where you have 7 or 8 top players and everyone knows who's going to go when and where, and others just don't have as much talent. Did Jimmy ever address that argument that his chart, while helpful, isn't necessarily just positive?
Yeah, the bigger issue to me, and it's that this is a generational thing, is with the salary cap. Now, draft picks are in some ways more valuable because you have players under contract for so many years. But all I know is maybe Polian didn't use it, but teams are still using it. And, he made 55 trades in his 5 years with Dallas. And a lot of them were draft day trades. And to tell you the era, how different it was, to put you back there, the Giants made one trade in those 5 years, and it was with Dallas. So
I read that in the book. That's right.
Yeah, it was staggering. Some of the, so, now we're on draft day trades of, draft picks and everything. But back, when Jimmy came into the NFL, it wasn't like that. There were some teams that made trades, but nobody made trades like Dallas did in rebuilding that roster. And, I'm sure the draft value chart wasn't for everybody, but you look at the trades he made and why he made them, and it was a great value to him.
So I want to talk about his love of coaching and go back to his playing days a little bit, but we can't get past the discussion of Coach Johnson's trades without mentioning Herschel Walker. That trade seemed to have been a watershed. My brother, who's been a Minnesota Vikings fan since Super Bowl IV, and we put the razor blades away before every year. I remember him talking about what a great trade it was, and he was happy to get this superstar. But when you look at it now, and even close to the time, it's astonishing that the Cowboys and Johnson could have pulled that off in a professional league.
Yeah. First of all, I'm wondering about your family. You're a Dolphin fan, just suffering the last couple of decades, and your brother, a Viking fan. They've had their moments, but poor Indiana household to raise those two kids. That trade was interesting in that, again, you have to put yourself into that time. Because now you look at the trade and you say, wait a second, Jimmy was given the option of mediocre players, or at the end of the year, first or second or third round draft picks. Dump the players and take the draft picks. And when the point of view of today, you're like, well, forget the players. Look at those draft picks, 3 first round draft picks, 3 second round draft picks for Herschel Walker. That's as Jimmy called it, the great train robbery. But at the time, people were conditioned to say, and they looked at the players and like, well, there's a mediocre player. There's a mediocre player. There's 4 or 5 mediocre players for Herschel Walker. And Jimmy got ripped for it nationally. And it was only with time did everybody come to understand, wait a second, he didn't want the players. He wanted these. All of a sudden, he had a treasure chest of draft picks to rebuild a roster. And, he explained privately to Dallas writers at the time what he was doing, but it wasn't something people really understood until, it was the big game plan was executed.
Well, and taking us back to that time, was it Herschel Walker was a hell of a lot better running back than he was a Senate candidate. So we should say that.
Yeah.
No offense, Mr. Walker. And it was a time where running backs were much more valued in the sense that a lot of, if you look at the Super Bowl winning teams of the 70s and early to mid 80s, they were loaded with great running backs: Larry Zonka, Franco Harris, Tony Dorsett, the list goes on and on. So Herschel's status in the NFL at the time was way beyond what you would think of now. Is that fair?
Yeah, and it's also fair when you're looking. Think of what Jimmy stepped into. He stepped into a team that had the worst record in football, 3-13, and they lost their first 7 games in Dallas. And he's looking around. He's jogging. He's actually goes jogging every day with his staff, and they're kicking around what to do. And they have one really blue chip, Tristan with Herschel. Okay, it can't get worse and he says, what about trading Herschel Walker? And they chuckle because, wait, we can't trade Herschel Walker. But when you think about it from a building point of view, here they are 0-7. Here they are with one guy to dangle. And the truth was Jimmy didn't think Herschel was after working with him, he felt you had to build your own. He didn't want to do that. And his offensive line coach, Tony Wise, was saying as they'd watch film, why does he keep running into my offensive lineman? And so they wanted someone who would cut in their offense. And Herschel was a power backup, and so it wasn't a good fit for Herschel. It wasn't a good fit for Jimmy. And but you're right, Herschel around the league was seen as a top running back. I mean, Minnesota did it. They thought they were one player away. That was the mistake. Cleveland was about to do the deal. They just didn't have the draft picks. They thought they were one player away. And that's always, a mistake. As Jimmy said, that was a real mistake, thinking they were one player away.
And didn't Walker have like an amazing first game? I'm reaching way back here, but he like ran all over somebody 100 every yards and caught passes. And that really kind of fueled the Johnson, what the hell are you doing?
Yeah. In fact, Jimmy keeps on his phone an article written by a guy who became a pretty good friend of his, Randy Galloway of the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, that lays out Jimmy in the as this is the worst trade in the history of the NFL, basically, and he'll pull it up and chuckle, these days. So, but yeah, at the time they're 0-7. He's getting ripped for not only how him and Jerry came into Dallas, as these two corn pokes from Arkansas, but now he trades away their best player, and he's doing things a lot differently. And
that was before the dreaded T word, tanking.
Yeah.
Did anyone accuse him back then like you would now? I'm trying to think of someone who would be some sort of equivalent, not Mahomes level, but Justin Herbert or something like that, where you traded him away, your best player, or maybe choose someone on defense. But did anyone accuse him of just throwing away the season for the future?
I don't know that anybody connected it that way, but I've talked to Jimmy about the idea of tanking, and what he says is, people think we were, purposely went 1-15 that year. We were bad. I was trying to win every game, and so and we weren't. We traded one good player who people thought was great. I thought he was good. And so, people overvalued Herschel, and we got a lot for him. I had to trade him when the offers came in. But, his point was we weren't throwing people overboard to try to go 1-15. We were bad. We didn't have any talent.
You're listening
that was only 1-15.
You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest is Dave Hyde. He's a columnist for the Fort Lauderdale Sun-Sentinel. He is the co-author of Swagger, Super Bowls, Brass Balls, and Footballs, a memoir, with coach and Hall of Famer Jimmy Johnson. Jimmy was born in Texas, if I recall, if this is correct. You correct me if any of these things are wrong. He grew up in football country at a time where football, especially down in the South, was king. He played football at the University of Arkansas. And in reading your book and doing some research, you can replace Kevin Bacon with Jimmy Johnson. He is connected by one or two things to these names that are just unbelievable, including the fact, which I already knew, but I thought it was fascinating, that he went to high school with Janis Joplin.
Yeah, he called Janis Joplin Weeds, Weeds. I'm not. I think she was back to nature, and she would joke with him about being the jock. So they knew each other. It didn't like they were best friends or anything, but certainly they knew each other. He grew up in a hardworking but very lower middle class family. Lived in a duplex. His parents were from Arkansas. They came down to work, and his dad did in the oil business in Galveston, Texas, on the water there, and so it was a very like you said, he grew up playing football, and his high school team went to the state, I think, quarterfinals every year. And then it came down to where he was being recruited to go to college, and his parents told him he could go anywhere he wanted, but if he went anywhere other than Arkansas, they wouldn't come and watch him play. And so he accepted an offer from Arkansas sight unseen, and went there, and like a lot of people, some friendships were formed in college that came into play later in his life.
Let me give
but Robert, you talk about this 6 degrees of separation. One of his high school assistant on his high school team was Fred Akers, who became a longtime University of Texas, a very successful coach.
And Purdue University.
And Purdue, right? Yeah.
Where my son goes now. I've written down some other names here because I just think it's almost funny. I'm assuming that when Coach Johnson is having his Heinekens, as I recall, that's his favorite drink.
Heineken Light, yeah.
He must just laugh. He's also connected to Phil Robertson of Duck Dynasty.
Yeah, that is right. He coached his first job. He studied psychology in college. He was planning to take a job in industrial psychology. And after his senior year, the spring, right when he was about to graduate, he was in the football office, and the coaches from Louisiana Tech were in there. Arkansas was the number one defense in the country at the time. And the Louisiana Tech coaches there were studying the defense, and the defensive coordinator called, "Hey, Jimmy, why don't you draw up our defense? They'd probably get more out of it than if I did." So Jimmy went up to the chalkboard back then and drew up the defense and explained everything. Well, a couple months later, Louisiana Tech's defensive line coach had a heart attack, and they remembered his talk, called him up. "Hey, can you come in? He's recovering, but can you sub in this year?" And Jimmy said, "Sure." Well, that led to coaching. But at Louisiana Tech, first of all, he went on a recruiting trip across town, and there was Terry Bradshaw. He recruited, but the quarterback at Louisiana Tech was it Phil Robertson, the Duck Dynasty guy.
Just the idea that he helped recruit Terry Bradshaw. Now they, sit next to each other or sit on the same set on Fox is hysterical. He was also on a coaching staff with Barry Switzer, a future rival. And he was offered a job at Arkansas by future rival Lou Holtz.
Yeah. It's interesting as their careers crisscrossed, how their relationships changed. Really, he got along with Switzer. He's got some stories with Switzer, and one of the stories when Jimmy was at Oklahoma State and Switzer was at Oklahoma. Of course, Oklahoma's national power, and Oklahoma State was the little stepsister that Jimmy had some good years there, but nothing to take on Oklahoma nationally. And after one game, Oklahoma creamed Oklahoma State. Jimmy went out to midfield to shake Barry's hand, and an assistant came out and said to him, "Hey, Barry wanted me to come out here and tell you he left the game with 5 minutes to go to start college." so you talk about rubbing it in. But yeah, he coached with Jackie Sherrill. There's a lot of, when you go back and look at the minds of some of these staffs that these teams had that he was with, it's really telling.
We should note that when Jimmy Johnson left Oklahoma State to be the coach at the University of Miami, in 1984, I think was his first year. 85, 84, 85.
Right. 84.
Because Miami had just won the national championship, I think, in 83 when they beat Nebraska 31-30, and that terrific Turner Gill, Mike Rozier, Heisman Trophy winning team. That Miami of Florida beat Oklahoma, was it 3 straight years, including national championship?
Yes, and that's what Jimmy talks about. Suddenly he had the talent, and in fact they played in the 88 national championship game in the Orange Bowl, and Oklahoma was ranked number 1, 12-0, 11-0 going into the game. Miami was 2, and everybody's talking about it's a close game. What a matchup of great teams, and Jimmy spent the whole week telling his team. In fact, Steve Walsh says by the end of the thought Oklahoma was a trash team, the way that the coaches were talking about them, how we're going to kill them and beat them with speed. And Jimmy did change. He came in from the time he was a young coach. He had different ideas of speed, and you don't have to be as big if you're quick or fast. And he convinced Oklahoma's coaches to start using that idea, and that they had great teams with you remember the Selman brothers in the early early 70s, and then he took it to Pitt, and he brought it to Miami. That idea of he'd take linebacker who were a little too big and slow and make them defensive ends, and all of a sudden they'd be great pass rushers, and that's what he used. He'd talk about how big Oklahoma is. We don't care how big they are. We're going to run around them and or outquick them, and so that's what he did when he had the talent to beat Switzer, and he did.
Johnson was defensive coordinator, Coach Johnson was, for the University of Pittsburgh in 77 and 78. Did he know Marino back then, or did Marino get there the year after he left? Was he involved in recruiting? He had to be aware of him because Marino was one of the top recruits in the country.
Yeah, Marino went to Central Catholic in Pittsburgh, big football high school, and so he knew of him. But the year he went to Oklahoma State was the year Marino came to Pitt. Who he knew, Hugh Green. He knew Hugh. In fact, Hugh Green lived with him. Very good friends with him and his family, and the guys like, I'm trying to think who else off that team. Was Jackie Sherrill was the head coach.
Jimbo Colbert played on that. Dave Wanstadt.
Yeah. Ricky Jackson, I believe, did. So he knew, but Marino came after him.
You could put together a hell of a team if you took the entire history of the University of Pittsburgh. Tony Dorsett, Bill Freilich, Larry Fitzgerald.
One of the stories when I was covering the Dolphins early on, Marino, during a practice, was there. He's across the field, and him and his offensive coordinator, Gary Stevens, who coached for years with Jimmy, but this was during when Shula was the head coach. They're sitting there. All of a sudden, they're raising their voices and they're arguing. They're pointing fingers. Jimmy calls over Hugh Green, who's sitting there, who's been traded to the Dolphins that year. Hugh starts arguing. They're raising their and as a reporter, you're sitting there. What happened? What are they talking about? What are they talking about? And they come off the field. Marino's face is red, and hey, Dan, what was that about? And he goes, Gary thinks his University of Miami teams could have beat our Pitt teams, and Pitt of that era had great teams.
Hugh Green was a game-changing defensive.
Tony Dorsett. Yeah.
So at the University of Miami is where Jimmy Johnson, I'm going to say, comes to prominence. Maybe there's no other way to say it. As a Notre Dame fan, lifelong. I didn't really think much of the University of Miami. They never really they never came on the radar, right? We were always waiting to play Michigan or USC, but the University of Miami in Miami of Florida's fortunes changed considerably in the early 80s. They hired Howard Schellenberger from the Shula coaching tree. He was part of the perfect team, if I recall correctly. And Miami started to build something Then they get Jimmy Johnson, and he puts together a run that is shocking in the amount of talent that he has and the success. The only two things that I can really, maybe three, would be Bobby Bowden, who he finished in the top 5 at Florida State, 14 years in a row.
Yeah. 13 or 14. Yeah. They've been right. Nick Saban has been on a run lately.
He's next. And then I was going to say Pete Carroll at USC, but
right.
Those Miami teams of the mid to late 80s, you were around then, Miami Herald, as I recall. What were they like, and how did those teams, those successful teams, reflect Jimmy's personality?
Yeah, it's interesting because here's Jimmy, this brash coach with big. I mentioned, the size and speed that the traditional coaches initially blanched at. They didn't want him to. So he had all these ideas, and now he comes to this school that, until Howard won the national title in the late 70s, they were thinking of disbanding football at Miami. And so they won the national title, but it was almost like a one-hit wonder. Everything worked magically to win the title. They really weren't a well-formed program just yet. Schnellenberger left. Here comes Jimmy. He wasn't allowed to hire his staff. He had to inherit the staff, which caused all sorts of problems his first year. But then he brings in his own staff. They went 40-4 the next 4 seasons. And all his ideas of how to be allow players to play free to under his system. He didn't care if they danced or talked. And these are guys come off the streets of Miami. A lot of them are streets of Fort Lauderdale. And all of a sudden, rather than this pastoral game of bula bula of college football in State College or Lincoln, Nebraska, it was for the first time, really sort of like Georgetown and basketball. That was sort of the idea of how Miami played, and it changed. Sports Illustrated ran a poll of the most hated teams, and the University of Miami's '87 team was number 1. His Dallas team, his Cowboys team, were number 3, and that tells you not only were they good, but they did things differently than everybody else too. And he was fine with that. Michael Irvin came once into his office when there was a lot of national criticism of the way they behaved and acted. And he said, "Coach, you doing all right?" And Jimmy said, "You just keep winning and I'll be fine." So that was, again, you talk to Jimmy now, and those were his favorite days because not only were they winning, he was in a city he loved. It was it was all new and fresh winning like that for him on a big stage.
Well, in Miami in the mid to, let's just say, the 80s, you had Miami Vice. It's very popular. Scarface, which a movie still gets quoted. The Dolphins went to 2 Super Bowls in the early to mid 80s and still had Marino, even though the late 80s weren't very kind to the Dolphins. So the Hurricanes just fit right in with everything else that was happening there.
Yeah, it was all of a sudden, it was like neon lights went on in the city, and the way the Hurricanes played, the way Jimmy coached, and Marino throwing the ball all over the field on the Dolphins. It was an electric time round.
Let me ask about a couple of games during Coach Johnson's tenure at the U. First would be the loss to Penn State. I think it's after the 86 season. They lose in the Fiesta Bowl. It was a big deal because, hell, no one had heard of the Fiesta Bowl until then. And they pull the teams and they're 2 independents so they can go to the Fiesta Bowl. There was all this hype. I think Penn State won 14-10.
Right.
No one thought they were going to win. Joe Paterno represents, everything you're just talking about, the, rock, paper, and scissors of what college football should be about, ironically, which I notice is in the book Swagger. There's a mention of Mr. Paterno, Coach Paterno, in his fall. But anyway, Penn State Penn State was not favored. Miami was. They had Vinny Testaverde, and Miami wore the fatigues and were brash and lost. What did that mean to the coach of the Miami Hurricanes, Jimmy Johnson? Did he see that coming? Because I know in your book, he takes the blame for that loss. 100% makes it clear it's 100% his fault.
Yeah, Vinny Testaverde is the quarterback, and he threw, I believe, 5 interceptions that game. And Jimmy talks about he didn't manage the game. He didn't manage the quarterback. He didn't manage the game. He didn't manage the quarterback from Vinny won the Heisman. He went on awards. He was going to banquets instead of practicing. And then he had a scooter accident, a famous scooter accident at the time, where he skidded up part of his side of his body and he couldn't practice. And so he goes into this game. He's not prepared to play. And then he starts throwing interceptions. If you look at the stats, Miami, it was 2-to-1 yardage, 2-to-1 first downs. They just dominated on the stat sheet everywhere but those 5 interceptions. And Jimmy blames himself for not either changing quarterback, toning down the game plan so they're running the ball and not. So the upshot for Jimmy is because he never, he went into the game thinking like everybody, we're going to kick them. But that was sort of his mentality most games where he's telling the players that's how he coached. Others would say be fearful of bulletin board material or teams getting overconfident. That wasn't his way. His way was always, especially if he thought he had the better team, you do this, this, and this, we're going to win. Okay.
And 80s that year, he said, I think in the book, you guys write, that was his best team ever.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's really I don't know if regret, but probably it is for him. That's the one game he looks back on and I'm sure would love to have back because he loved that. Not only was his best, he loved the team. He loved, the players on that team, the mindset, Jerome Brown on defense, and Highsmith on offense. And you go down the line of those that really, he thought he came out as a coach with those players and he wished he'd rewarded them or they could sit there and talk about the national championship through the years. But afterwards, it had a big effect on him in that he became a lot as more of a dictator, more of someone who never counted on anything. More a guy who the next year at Arkansas, I think they were up 44-3, and the school presidents in the press box saying, "Why are they still scoring?" And Jimmy said, "Why? Because I'm never gonna let up off the pedal again in a game after what." So it changed him as a coach.
The next year, he wins the national championship, defeating Oklahoma, I think, in the Orange Bowl. Was it 20-14?
Yep.
How did that validate him in his own mind, the way he drove players, the way he coached, how he chose his profession to finally, beat Oklahoma, beat Barry Switzer, and redeem what had happened the previous year?
Well, with Jimmy, there's sort of a journey to that game, and he goes to Oklahoma State, and the first year was pretty good. Second year, they're not, they took a step backwards, and every Thursday night, staff to, they had a place in every city. And it was a nacho place, and it's a Mexican place in most cities because that's what Jimmy liked. And he could see everybody's downcast, and he said, guys, stick with me. We're going to win a national title. Okay. If you just stick with me, keep to our plan, keep to how we coach. And his point was, we didn't win it at Oklahoma State, but we won it at Miami. All right. And it was when they're 0-7 and a 1-15. Stick with me. We're going to win the Super Bowl. So I think it not only gave him national credibility, but it validated a lot of his ideas and the manner he coached. That okay, this not only does it work, but it works at the highest level.
I would be amiss, since I've had Chris Zorich on the podcast, I've not mentioned 1988, the game in South Bend, the U, Miami of Florida versus Notre Dame. Best college football game I've ever watched. Did you go up there to cover that game?
I wasn't. Was I there for that? I wasn't there for that one. I started going, I believe, the next year, '89, to those games. So I was there for several of them, but that rivalry was
you can't imagine how intense it was unless you were alive then. And it was like a root canal. It was so intense for a short period of time, and then it was so intense that Notre Dame and Miami stopped scheduling each other, which I think is funny. I think it was Notre Dame's decision. Did you see the Catholics versus convicts 30 for 30?
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
What did you think of that and how they talked about that game? Because it's interesting. The thing that I took away from it was that Coach Johnson said, quote, I think I'm getting this direct. In the end, history shows they were the better team. That was shocking to me that he said that.
I'm trying to remember what he says. He also says that if there was replay, in like now that Cleveland Gary would have scored either he would have scored a touchdown or it would have been right at the 1 inch line of the goal line if they called him down, and it wouldn't have been a game changing play. Wouldn't have been a game changing play, and as he says, I would have won a second national title, and Lou Holtz wouldn't have won any. So,
how did he and Lou Holtz get along? I mean, they had a weird history together.
There's some gamesmanship there back with him and Lou Holtz.
You're listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest is Dave Hyde. He is co-author with Hall of Famer Jimmy Johnson of the book Swagger, Super Bowls, Brass Balls, and Footballs, a memoir. So let's get Jimmy to Dallas. I was in the Army when this happened, and it was big news back then, especially since I was at Fort Bliss and everybody was a Cowboys fan. How did Jimmy replace a legend like Tom Landry and keep his sanity? And I mean that in the sense that Tom Landry was so revered. He had had 2 or 3 bad seasons in a row. No one had ever heard of Jerry Jones. He comes in to buy the team. I mean, they really kind of run roughshod through the whole city. But it seems that in your book that just replacing Landry just didn't seem like it was something that he thought about much. Am I wrong in that? That wasn't like, oh my God, what am I going to do? How am I going to replace this guy?
Yeah, it's interesting. You look at his career. So he replaced Schnellenberger coming off a national title at Miami. Schnellenberger was very popular. As you said, he coached with the Dolphins, and he the media loved him. The fans loved him. He never thought anything about replacing. Now, Landry is obviously bigger on a national scale. But he did Don Shula with the Miami Dolphins. And his way was never to worry about that. He never looked back. In fact, he caused a stir with the Dolphins when he came in his first team banquet. He said, who cares about that? I'm here for the guys who are here now. I don't care all this talk about the past and all that. I don't want to hear any of that. And that's, he knew how to play the game in Dallas as far. Landry was a great legend and great coach, but honestly, he didn't think about that. He was miserable in Dallas the first year, not because he's the shadow cast by Landry, but because they had an awful team.
Well, let me ask you the same question kind of where I did with the Hurricanes. He's at Dallas. Is it 5 or 6 years? They go 1-15, then they go 7-9, and then they make the playoffs, and then they win 2 Super Bowls. I think that's how it goes. But if he had stayed at Dallas, and it comes through in your book, I mean, are we talking about a Belichick-esque run in Dallas for 10 to 15 years?
Well, that's what Troy Aikman tells him. He the players were upset he left. Aikman tells him we could have been Tom Brady and Bill Belichick before Tom Brady and Bill Belichick. And Michael Irvin, of course, says they would have won, I forget, 5 or 6 Super Bowls. the difference is Belichick's cut for that long stay, the long haul. And Jimmy was he was up and down. The way he coached, high emotion. He brought, everybody. The phrase in sports is "don't get too high or don't get too low." No, he got high and he got low, and he took everybody with him. And so a couple of things happened that we could get into. One was his relationship with Jerry Jones. The other thing was he didn't like the guy he had to be to the lion tamer, the dictator, and so he wanted out. But yeah, if he had stayed another year, Peter King, in talking with him, the NFL, the really respected NFL writer, told him after Super Bowl II, they're riding in the limo away, and Jimmy's just not happy. And he goes, "Are you thinking of leaving?" And he goes, "I don't know, Peter." He goes, "If you stay one more, that's 3 Super Bowls. You're in the Hall of Fame." And it didn't mean anything to him at the moment. Later in life, when he's removed and everything, being in the Hall of Fame meant a lot to him. But at the time, that's just like he didn't think of who he was replacing. He didn't think of things like, "Oh, if I stay one more year, I'll be in the Hall of Fame."
Would you say that Jimmy Johnson, here in Indiana, we're familiar with coaching dictators? Would you say that Jimmy Johnson, along with Bill Belichick, are kind of the last of the coaching dictators that were so prevalent in the NFL in the 60s and 70s and 80s?
I would, but Jimmy just does it a different way than like a Bobby Knight or although he says when he's asked, "Would your ways work in today's NFL?" And he says they are. And what do you mean they are? He goes, "Well, his coaches exactly like I would accept the public presence." Jimmy talked through the press. He talked in headlines, and Belichick obviously is more reserved, shall we say, in publicly. But as far as how to manage a team, how to, just be ruthless, cut guys, Jimmy cut guys who out of meetings, cut guys who fumbled. He was ruthless as a coach, and in that way, yeah, that's not something you really see in today's NFL. Now, to go along with that, he also, again, let players be themselves. He had no problem with them, as long as they played within his rules. They could play freely, and talk and dance and do a lot of things that other coaches wouldn't allow.
It seems to me, of all of Jimmy's players, and I'm going to ask you about 2 or 3 of them, but of all of them, Michael Irvin seems to be the prototypical Jimmy Johnson football player.
Yeah, from the standpoint that, first of all, highly talented, and second of all, brash. He played with an attitude that you could see. And yet there was also the things that people never saw or rarely did was appreciate how hard he worked. And I remember being at the University of Miami and a guy's being disciplined, a Miami player is being disciplined for something. He's having to run laps after practice. And there's Michael Irvin running with him, and not just to be a good teammate. And Irvin would wear, he would wear people out to run more sprints. I got to know Michael a little. He was inducted in the Broward Hall of Fame because he's from Fort Lauderdale. And before that, I went with him to his neighborhood. And as we're walking in the neighborhood by his house, he's bending down, wiping gravel away from the street, looking for something. And I said, "What are you looking for?" And he goes, I painted marks on the road here when I was a kid. And I was just seeing if they were still there. And he'd paint 10-yard marks, then 50 come from high school practice and run sprints. And then he'd, up and down the street. Then he'd run 3 miles. So he was the perfect player for Jimmy in that, not only, in fact, Jimmy, when he got to Dallas, he would ask, when they're looking at a player to draft, he'd ask his draft pick, is he a Miami guy? Meaning, does he play with an attitude? Does he, not just high talent, but coachable, but with a big attitude? Those are the guys.
We're talking with journalist and author and Winston Churchill aficionado,
Wow.
Dave Hyde, just judging by the books that are behind you as we conduct this interview.
Yeah.
One of the best parts of your book, to me, really was the dissection, and I'd like for you to talk about for a few minutes, of the relationship between Jimmy Johnson and Jerry Jones. To me, I mean, if you had to parson out the credit for the Cowboys dynasty in the early to mid 90s, it would be 99% Jimmy, 1% Jerry, but I'm obviously biased. But it just seemed like Jerry Jones ruined a good thing. Like, what are you doing? You've got this amazing team, this wonderful coach, and you're upset because you're not getting enough credit?
Yeah. In fact, Jerry, a couple years ago, before a season, basically broke down in tears saying, yeah, I really screwed it up, didn't I? And so they had a weird relationship. In fact, the first time it sort of leads off the chapter with Jerry in the book where Jimmy says, a lot of people say they don't understand my relationship with Jerry. And he goes, I appreciate that because I don't understand it either. So
they've been friends for decades before he took over the
yeah.
Cowboys. They knew each other. They played football together at Arkansas.
That got a little overblown in the when they went together to Dallas. Oh, these college roommates, best buddies, and all that. Well, I mean, Jerry played. They were roommates Friday night before games because they were alphabetically beside each other. Yeah. And then the Arkansas coaches, every Friday night road game, you'd room with this guy. So yeah, they knew each other. They liked each other, but Jerry was older. He played offense he played offense, and Jimmy was younger and played defense. So while they knew each other and they liked each other, they weren't best friends or anything like that. So, but they did keep tabs on each other, and every few years at a reunion or whatever would talk, and they followed each other's careers, and obviously crushed it in making money, and Jimmy became the coach he did. And so when Jerry went to buy the team, he wanted Jimmy to be his coach, and Jimmy was had won in college at that point, and he couldn't turn down the lure and challenge of going to the pros. So and for as bad as the Cowboys were on the field when Jimmy took him over, that bad in the business department too when Jerry took him over. So the first couple of years, Jerry spent all his time turning around the business of the Cowboys, and Jimmy spent all his time turning around the football team. Well, about year 3, when they started to win a little, by then Jerry had turned a team that was losing $1 million a month into one that was making a lot of money. And yet, as he told Jimmy, I can make a $5 million deal and nobody cares, but you can trade for a third string guard, and everybody's, whoa. And he said, as Jimmy tells it, he then said the line that Jimmy knew was going to cause problems. He said, I want some of that fun, and when they originally did the deal, Jimmy had all control of football. In fact, we put it in the book, the contract, spelling out Jimmy, but Jerry kept wanting to change the wording in the contract that he would, and Jimmy doesn't think he really wanted to make trades or, talk about who should play or game plans. He just wanted some of that fun. He wanted for people to look at him and say, "Oh yeah, good job, Jerry."
Yeah, you're the mastermind. That trade. Well, I remember, was it on Monday Night Football that Jimmy Johnson jokingly referred to Jerry Jones as Michael Jackson? You remember that?
No, I don't remember. But
Jones had like a face peel. Jones had like a face peel or something, and Coach Johnson said, "What's going on down there in Dallas with Michael Jackson? I mean, Jerry Jones."
It's funny, Jimmy will say, we see each other, we hug, we laugh, we chuckle, and then I'll read something in a line or I'll say something, and they have an odd relationship.
But the killer quote that really comes through the book, and you could almost, in the words that Coach Johnson uses in the book, that it went beyond just ribbing or arguing or fussing about who gets credit, is when Jerry Jones said, there are 500 coaches who could have won the Super Bowl with the Dallas Cowboys. Yeah, I got the sense that was beyond the pale to Jimmy Johnson. Like, do you understand how much work I've put into, creating this? What do you mean any one of 500 coaches?
Yeah, Jimmy had built that football program to the point that any of 500 coaches, and it was proven when he brought Barry Switzer out of retirement, and they won a Super Bowl his second year there. So, but he didn't appreciate what it took to keep a team on top. Jerry didn't. He didn't appreciate the constant need to bring in more talent and older talent and all that went with it. So Jimmy got off a train that was going 100 miles per hour, and Barry Switzer got on, and he thought he was driving it going 100 miles an hour, and it was just slowly coasting to a stop. And in fact, in the book, it was the Dallas Cowboys, after Jimmy's talent left. They didn't go to the playoffs or win a playoff game for 12 years. And that was shown to a couple people when a couple people in the Dallas who were part of that Dallas organization, oh, that's not true. We did. But then they looked it up and they go, oh my God, we didn't win for 12 years. And so it was hey, Jerry's doing what he wants to do. He's running the team. He's saying he's running the team. And you can't discount what he's nice, but they haven't won again. They haven't come close, really.
And he gets to do the interviews and the press conferences and be quoted in 20-point font and that sort of thing. It's an
odd scene. The Dallas Cowboys are an odd scene in that after the game, some media goes to the head coach, but the rest of a bigger herd of media has to watch Jerry Jones because you never know what he's going to say. That's how he's having the fun he wanted. He owns the team. So that's his right.
We have a few minutes left with sports columnist Dave Hyde. I have purposely truncated the amount of time we get to talk about Jimmy Johnson's tenure as the coach of my Miami Dolphins. I remember when he was hired that, like everyone else, I thought, oh my God, this is it. This is what we've been waiting for. And Huizenga, we all thought it's been waiting for. And we love Shula, but, he's been here since 1970 and we need someone else. And I couldn't have been more shocked or disappointed about how he was there, I think, 4 years for the Dolphins, how that turned out. How did you describe his tenure with the Dolphins? And could it just be summed up in the words of just be too late? He got there too late for Marino.
Yeah. I think that's when he took the job, he knew it had to be they had a lot of, they had some good talent, but they were also way over the salary cap. And
Eric Green, my God.
Yeah, right.
Instead of Bryce Paup.
Jimmy had to dump players overboard to get under the cap. And he wanted to do it the way, building with young players through the draft. But he knew he had to do it really quick because his first practice, he walks out there and has jog around the field, and Marino comes to him and says, well, I can jog around the field, but then I can't practice because my knees. And Jimmy thought, oh boy, he's in worse shape than Jimmy expected, I think. And so, it just comes to he couldn't build it up quickly enough. He built the defense. Drafted Zach Thomas, I'm sure, is going to make the Hall of Fame this year. The Hall of Famers off that team, 2 Pro Bowl cornerbacks. He just couldn't get that the talent quickly enough on the offense, and
it just killed him. That T.O. Green's destroyed his knee.
Yeah.
Everyone says he's a bust. Well, he's not a bust if he blows his knee out. I think in the very first practice or the very first day, first round draft pick. Do you get the sense that as you covered it, and I remember reading about it, the Marino-Johnson relationship, it certainly didn't, the Johnson-Aikman relationship was cold and then got warm. And now, now it's the pictures, the video of Aikman in tears as Jimmy Johnson is, told he's in the Hall of Fame is just beautiful. But I've read interviews with Marino, and then it's in the book where Marino's like, look, we got along fine. Like, we wanted to win. We wanted to do these things. Did we disagree a little bit about game strategy? Sure. But as far as getting along and seeing the big picture and wanting to do what it takes to win, everything was fine. I mean, that's basically what Dan Marino says in his, football life special from the NFL. Is that revisionist history on the part of Dan Marino, or what was it like then? Because I was at the Dolphins game in Indianapolis in 99 that Marino wins here, where he throws the pass to Gadsden, and then he throws the fade to Gadsden to win 34-31. I was there. And then you read about it afterward, that game was played in the middle of all this Johnson Marino drama. Was there overhyped, or was it real, or both?
I think it was probably a little of both. I think I don't know, revisionist history, but everybody's trying to be nice now. You remember they went to the playoffs 3 out of Jimmy's 4 years. They won 2 playoff games. But as Jimmy says, he knew after this first or second year that they weren't going to win the Super Bowl. And so his idea, instead of trying to win it all, they'd win as many games as they could. And, he felt like the need to Dan's physical talent was fading. And his last year, remember, he got hurt.
Shoulder.
Neck. And Damon Hewitt came in and they won 7 straight games. Or no, I think they went 5-1, something like that. Marino came in back at Dallas, Thanksgiving Day, and just an awful game. He wasn't healthy, and so these were 2 fierce competitors, and they weren't succeeding at the level they wanted. And so I think there were some strained relationships there that maybe time has healed some of the wounds.
When Coach Johnson says, as he says in your book, I wish I had gotten to coach Dan Marino earlier, you think that's a sincere sentiment, or more of the let's get along?
I think that definitely sincere, in that he looked at Marino in the 80s and the early 90s, and one of the shaves of Marino's careers from 86 to 90, they went to, I think it's 4 or 5 straight years. He had no talent around. They were a 500 team, and
the worst first round draft picks in the history of the NFL, multiple years in a row.
Yeah,
Kumaro, Boza, Hampton, Ship.
Sammy Smith. we can really depress you as a Dolphin fan by going through that list, but no one doubted the talent of Marino. And you talk to his teammates, you talk to guys who played against him, they knew what a talent Marino was. So absolutely, I'm sure Jimmy would have loved to coach, and he had the right attitude of that cocky attitude that Marino loved, that Jimmy loved to coach too.
The last question I want to ask you before we get to the 5 questions we ask all of our guests is, Jimmy Johnson became a member of the media per se in his work at Fox. And then he works with you, a member of the media. You've written, every so often in your columns in the Fort Lauderdale Sun-Sentinel, your columns are basically with Jimmy Johnson. It's you two having a conversation and you print the results of that conversation. How did Jimmy get along with the press, and how did the press get along with Jimmy? Because, both can be hard to tame.
Yeah. Jimmy, look, here's Jimmy's worldview. When he's winning, everything's great. Okay. He's the happiest guy, and he's great to work with. Losing, or they're not getting to the standards he was a lot harder to work with. But I will say, even in Dallas, he was great. When I first met him at the University of Miami, they were winning. He's his big personality, a lot of fun. I mean, there were moments, of course, because things were controversial, but he didn't shy away from anything. Then you go to Dallas and you talk to the writers about, they loved covering him. Even
he's news.
Even that. Yeah. He did things like Peter King went with him on a draft scouting trip. He allowed the media inside to see his world. There were things you knew not to say because he didn't want you giving away state secrets of what he's thinking. Mm-hmm. But he let you in to see how things really operated. And from our side, if you get let in like that you get okay. So things were rough at Miami because we've gone through some of it. While they again made the playoffs, they won 2 playoff games in 4 years. That's more than they've won in the last 20 quarter century almost since he left, which is embarrassing to the franchise. But the point is, they didn't succeed to the level he wanted, and so there were rough moments. But what you love to cover it from my side is excellence, and you always knew Jimmy was an excellent coach, even if the results weren't always. He was just winning a playoff game instead of the Super Bowl, and he was fun to cover.
We've reached the point on the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests. Dave Hyde, are you ready?
I'm all set. I'm pumped for this.
What was your first job?
My first job? You mean that not in journalism, but in my first job, I worked for a tow truck company for 5 years. And while I was starting in high school, and I would, with a acetylene torch, they had a junkyard, and I would cut engines out of junk cars and then put them on a flatbed truck, the frame of the carcass of the car, and I'd take it to a shredder. And then I tow cars for a while, and so you see why I appreciated sitting in press box and eating hot dogs.
Number 2, what was your first concert?
First concert was the Beach Boys. I was 15. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, and the Beach Boys played in St. John Arena, which was Ohio State's basketball arena at the time, and went and saw the Beach Boys. And I just remember all these people from the Midwest pretending that they were on surfing safaris and all this stuff that was so foreign to me that it was a lot of fun.
Number 3, if you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
Well, besides Swagger, of course.
Or Still Perfect.
Yeah.
Or 1968.
Or throw that in too. What book I would suggest? Well, the best historical biography I've read is Peter the Great.
By Massey.
Yeah, Robert Massey. It's a tremendous story and lays out this the East against and the West, and open thinking and change generations and worlds. And but I was a history major, so there's a lot of Churchill. The first two biographies, is it up here?
The Manchester volumes?
Yeah, the Manchester volumes were tremendous, and I read them, and then I was waiting for the third one, and he said he didn't have the energy to go on with that. So, I love to read history books, and so I'd throw those two out there.
Well, this next question is right up your alley. If you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
Yeah, my neighbor, he co-founded the Miami Heart Institute here, and he died. He died about 25 years ago, but he was responsible as a doctor for getting the wounded off Omaha Beach, and the stories he has. I would love to. Would I really want to see that? I don't know, but some of the things he went through and the stories he tells, it would have been. I don't know that I want to be in that battle to witness it, but the moment.
Did you watch Saving Private Ryan with him?
Yeah, right. That's why that what comes to mind when you think of you really wouldn't want to be in, because it's such a gut-wrenching and bloody affair. So I'm sure there's something else that would come to mind, but when you said it, that's the first thing that came to mind.
Last question. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record just to chat, whom would you choose?
First thought, Bill Murray.
Well, he is a Cinderella story.
I know it would be fun. It's a Groundhog Day. Just because I'd love to sit there, sit at a bar, and all of a sudden I look over, there'd be Bill Murray, and I'd like to laugh with him.
I'm sure that's exactly what would happen. You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmong Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our guest today has been Dave Hyde. He is the co-author, along with Coach and Hall of Famer Jimmy Johnson, of the new book, Swagger, Super Bowls, Brass Balls, and Footballs, a memoir. We'll be sure to put a link on our social media channels for you to buy the book. Dave, as a Miami Dolphins fan since 1972, it's an honor to talk to you. Thank you so much. I love your columns. Like I said, I subscribe to the Fort Lauderdale Sun-Sentinel so I can read your columns during football season and beyond. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Your book was wonderful. It's a great read.
Robert, it was a lot of fun, and I appreciate you being all these years reading my columns. A lot of fun to talk to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.
This podcast was produced and edited by Chris Spangle and Leaders and Legends LLC. If you're interested in starting a podcast or taking yours to the next level, please contact us at leadersandlegends.net.